Welcome to Diary of the World. I'm your host, Carrie. This is part 2 of the modern history of Ukraine. We'll talk about the years 1989 to 1994 of Ukraine's history. In the last episode, we covered a lot of ground, from the thaw of Khrushchev, where Ukrainian writers and intelligentsia like Ivan Dzhuba expressed their qualms with the Soviet Union's control over Ukraine. We talked about the era of stagnation under Brezhnev and Cherbytsky's tight control over Ukraine. Finally, we left off a little after the Chernobyl catastrophe in the late 1980s. The people of Ukraine were about to transition from being controlled by the Soviet Union to building their own free, sovereign Ukraine state. Before we begin, I want to point out a few things that may be helpful for you while you're listening. First of all, becoming a country and a democracy are long processes. It's a marathon, not a sprint. While I was reading Serhii Plokhy's book, Gates of Europe, I had to reread the parts about Ukraine establishing itself. I never imagined on my own what it was like to start a country or what it would be like to divorce from the Soviet Union. When Ukraine had its first democratic election, this doesn't mean Ukraine became a perfect democracy overnight. I just don't want you to jump to conclusions and then get confused, think, wait, there was an election. How could there be corruption or a candidate that's a puppet of Russia? Additionally, an army didn't just magically appear, it had to be built. Next, I want to explain a position that should not go overlooked, but easily could. That's the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR. This role would help pave the way for Ukraine's freedoms. For most of the Soviet period, the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR was a ceremonial figurehead. They presided over the republic's parliament, they signed laws that had already been decided by the Communist Party. They represented the republic in formal events or signed greetings and decrees. In reality, all the decisions, from the industrial plans to the educational policies, came from the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, who answered directly to Moscow. So, for decades, the chairman was like a symbolic head of state without real political control. When Mikhail Gorbachev began reforms, remember perestroika, which means restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness, the old balance of power started to change. So here's what happened. Parliaments in the republics began to debate and pass real legislation, not just rubber-stamp Moscow's directives. The chairman of the Supreme Soviet became the official head of state of the republic, not just in name, but in practice. He was now able to sign laws, appoint officials, and represent the republic abroad. This was the first time in Soviet history that the Ukrainian SSR had a position resembling a president in function, even before independence. By the years 1989 to 1990, the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine could now sign a law declaring Ukrainian the state language, even though such a move had once required Moscow's approval. He could refuse to approve local appointments if they were unpopular with other deputies. He could negotiate with leaders of other republics about trade, energy, or autonomy, something that was unthinkable 10 years earlier. Under Gorbachev's reforms, he could even allow live television broadcasts of parliamentary debates, which would give Ukrainians their first real look at public political discussion. Those powers were still limited. He couldn't control the army or foreign policy, but compared to the ceremonial rubber stamp role of the 1970s, this was a massive transformation. Now, who are the main players of today's episode? We're going to be putting the spotlight on Leonid Kravchuk, the cautious and clever politician who helped guide Ukraine from a Soviet republic to an independent nation. We'll also look at the life of Levko Lukyanenko, a dissident political prisoner and author of Ukraine's Declaration of Independence. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for undermining the Communist Party and smearing the Marxist ideology. He would end up having spent 27 years in prison. Even in prison, he kept protesting for Ukraine to secede from the Soviet Union. Now I feel like we're prepared to start the story. Without further ado, Ukraine's story from 1989 to 1994. It was March 18, 2014, in the Kremlin's ornate St. George's Hall. Russian President Vladimir Putin stood before the Russian parliament to announce that Crimea, a region that had been part of Ukraine since 1954, would now be annexed by Russia. In his speech, Putin justified the move by claiming that Russia and Ukraine were one people, a single whole. He argued that Crimea's separation from Russia had been a historical mistake made in the chaos of the Soviet collapse, and that Russia was merely restoring historical justice. As Putin spoke, the audience repeatedly broke into applause. When he announced that Crimea was being reunited with Russia, the hall erupted. People stood, clapped, and many had visible emotion on their faces. Some people shouted, "Russia! Russia!" State TV cameras zoomed in on officials smiling, nodding, and even tearing up. At the end of the speech, there was a standing ovation, long, loud, almost theatrical. It was designed to be a moment of triumph, like Russia was reclaiming something lost. Outside that hall, the reaction in Russia was overwhelmingly supportive. At least it was presented publicly that way. Crowds celebrated in Moscow's Red Square and in cities across Russia, waving flags and holding signs that said, "We are together and Crimea is ours." Russian state media portrayed Putin as a hero who was defending Russian people, and his approval rating soared above 80%, the highest it had been in years. It became known as the Crimean Consensus. For a while, even many Russians who weren't usually political rallied around Putin. While Russians were cheering, the rest of the world saw the speech very differently. In Western capitals, leaders viewed it as a turning point. It was the moment that Putin abandoned cooperation with the West and embraced an openly imperialist vision of Russia's role in the world. To them, his emotional talk about history and unity was a justification for breaking international law in order to seize another country's territory by force. Let's talk about what happened on that day in 2014, when Putin said that Russia and Ukraine are one people, a single whole, and that taking Crimea was restoring historical justice. He was arguing that Ukraine isn't truly a separate nation. It's just a part of Russia that somehow got separated. Therefore, Russia has the right or even the duty to bring it back under its control. So obviously that kind of reasoning is dangerous because it denies Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. It's like saying, that country next to us isn't really a country. It actually belongs to us. In international law, that's not a valid reason to invade or take over another nation's territory. Every country has the right to make its own decisions and control its own borders. So when Putin framed the invasion of Crimea and later actions in Ukraine as, quote, historical justice, he was trying to make aggression sound noble or inevitable, like he was fixing a mistake, not committing an act of war. Putin's idea that Ukraine and Russia were inseparable was already dying long before he made his speech in 2014. Let's go back to the late 80s when a man named Levko Lukyanenko walked free from prison and began to write the words that would end the Soviet Union. It was the spring of 1988, and after more than 25 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps, Levko Lukyanenko stepped off a train in Kiev. He had spent 27 years in prison. Streets still had the same gray Soviet buildings, and long lines for food formed outside of stores. But something was different. Students in the parks were talking about perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev's promise to reform the system. On street corners, people whispered the word Rukh, the People's Movement of Ukraine, an organization that didn't officially exist yet, but was already alive in people's imaginations. And for the first time in decades, Ukrainian songs were being sung openly, not just in kitchens, but on public stages. Lukyanenko, now in his 50s, walked through the city and he sensed something new: hope. After a lifetime of punishment for believing Ukraine could be free, he was coming home to find a country beginning to believe it too. The People's Movement of Ukraine. It would oppose the Soviet Union and the only political party that existed at the time, the Communist Party. Lukyanenko, now in his 50s, walked through the city and could hear Ukrainian songs being sung in the open. Beyond the gray buildings and the humdrum of Soviet living, hope for an independent Ukraine state was present. Lukyanenko was coming home to find a country beginning to believe in its freedom. Gorbachev's perestroika was meant to fix the Soviet economy by allowing small reforms. A little more independence in the economy, and even some private business was springing up. Glasnost had an even bigger impact. It allowed people to speak more freely, to criticize the government, and to publish ideas that would have been banned just a few years earlier. These policy changes unleashed Ukrainians, writers, students, and intellectuals. They started talking about their culture and history in public again. They would form Rukh, which was initially a movement, but organized into a political party that would have a big role in Ukraine's independence. Another powerful change happened around this time in 1989. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, banned and forced underground since Stalin's time, was finally legalized. After decades of secret worship, priests and parishioners could hold services openly again. It was a spiritual revival and a sign that Soviet control was truly weakening. Then, in 1990, Ukraine held its first semi-free elections to its parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. The Communist Party still dominated, but for the first time, real opposition voices were elected, including members of RUK and other reformers. It wasn't full democracy yet, but it was a start. So RUK was now a political party, and it was contesting the Communist Party. Before I say the next sentence, please keep in mind here the position that we talked about earlier, chairman of the Supreme Soviet. That same year, we're still in 1989, Leonid Kravchuk, a longtime communist official, was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet, Ukraine's top governing body, and that position had changed dramatically from the old, mostly ceremonial role it used to be. He was careful and he was very experienced. He was the kind of politician who understood how to navigate change without losing any control. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika had loosened Moscow's grip to the point that they were losing control of the Union. Ukraine was ready to break free. The Communist Party's monopoly on power was breaking down. So when Kravchuk was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR in July 1990, he suddenly had real political power in his hands, more than any Ukrainian leader had held in decades. He presided over the Ukrainian parliament, which now had genuine political debates for the first time. As chairman, Kravchuk oversaw ministries and committees that had once been answerable to Moscow. He began negotiating directly with Russia and the other republics on economic and political agreements. He allowed the blue and yellow Ukrainian flag to fly next to the red Soviet flag, a powerful symbol at the time. It was an autumn day in Kiev in the year 1990. Trams and trolley buses rattled through the streets full of commuters. State-run stores sold food and clothing, but the shelves were often half empty. Lines for bread, butter, and sausage were common. Outdoor markets were beginning to reappear where farmers and families sold goods privately, one of the early signs of perestroika's economic reforms. Kiosks began popping up selling Western-style goods, magazines, cigarettes, and cassette tapes. There was a strange mix of scarcity and possibility. In the city's heart, Independence Square, or Maidan, hundreds of young people have gathered, wrapped in blankets, holding handmade signs. They're not shouting, they're fasting. These are university students, kids barely 20 years old, and they've begun a hunger strike that will last more than 2 weeks. They sleep in tents, study by candlelight, and write messages to their families promising they'll be fine. But everyone knows the risks. The Soviet Union still exists, and public protest is dangerous, even now under Gorbachev's reforms. So what are they demanding? Their goals are simple but bold. First, they want the resignation of the Prime Minister of Soviet Ukraine, Vitaly Maso. He was the Prime Minister of the Ukraine SSR from 1987 to October 1990. A longtime Communist Party loyalist, he was seen by the students and much of the public as a symbol of the old Soviet system, a Moscow man, obedient to Kremlin directives rather than representing Ukrainian interests. Their second demand was for Ukraine to withdraw from talks over Mikhail Gorbachev's proposed New Union Treaty, an agreement meant to reshape the crumbling Soviet Union into a looser federation and keep the republics tied to Moscow. But for these students, the treaty symbolized the very thing they were fighting against, another attempt to preserve Soviet control under a new name. They didn't want a rebranded union. They wanted to break free from it. The students wanted an independent Ukraine. At first, government officials try to ignore the students, and then they try to intimidate them, but they don't. As the hunger strike drags on, the government in Kiev is split. Some hardliners want to send in police to clear the square by force, but the man at the top, Leonid, chairman of the Supreme Soviet, chooses a different path. Leonid was not some radical nationalist fighting for Ukraine. In fact, he had spent his whole career in the Communist Party, but he understood that the world was changing, and that beating students in the middle of Kiev would only make divisions in Soviet politics clash even harder. So instead of ordering violence on the students, he opened negotiations. After 2 tense weeks, the government agreed to meet many of the students, and the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet, or the parliament, eventually forced Vitaly Maso to resign on October 17, 1990. This is what the students wanted and why they protested. So why this was significant? The peaceful protest in the Soviet capital of a republic, Kiev, was unthinkable a decade earlier. In October 1990, when the student hunger strike began in Independence Square, Leonid was chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR. Essentially, he was the top political leader in Ukraine. At that point, he was still a Communist Party loyalist, but he was a cautious reformer, someone who saw that the old Soviet system was cracking and knew that brute force could make things worse. As the hunger strike gained attention, some hardliners in the Communist Party wanted to send in police to clear the square, but Leonid refused to authorize a crackdown. Instead, he met with representatives of the students, listened to their demands, and helped broker a peaceful resolution. The protests ended without bloodshed, and that mattered enormously. It showed that even the Soviet leadership in Ukraine was beginning to bend to public pressure. The parliament soon declared Ukraine a sovereign state on July 16, 1990. It was not yet independent, but now legally above Moscow's authority. Leonid went from being seen as a rigid party bureaucrat to a pragmatic leader who could adapt, someone who might actually guide Ukraine through a peaceful transformation. That moment helped him build credibility that he would later use to lead Ukraine into independence. It's August 1991 and the Soviet Union is falling apart. By the end of 1991, all 15 Soviet republics would have declared independence. Factories are closing, republics are demanding independence, and the old communist elite are terrified that their empire is slipping away. To save what's left, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, retreats to his summer home on the coast of Crimea, a quiet place called Foros. He says he's going there to rest, but really, he's trying to finalize a new Union treaty, a last attempt to hold the Soviet republics together in a looser, more democratic federation. It's his gamble to reform the USSR before it breaks apart completely. But not everyone in the USSR wants reform. In Moscow, a group of die-hard communists, top officials from the KGB, the military, and Gorbachev's own government decide they've had enough. They believe Gorbachev has gone too far, that perestroika and glasnost have destroyed the party's control. They want to go back to ruling the Soviet Union strictly. So, while Gorbachev is in Crimea, they cut off his phone lines, surround his villa with guards, and demand that he sign a decree declaring martial law to stop the reforms. Gorbachev refuses. The men storm out, and the next morning, the Soviet people wake up to a lie. On August 19, 1991, the radical communists go on television to announce that Gorbachev is, quote, ill, and that a new state committee on the state of emergency is taking over the country. They roll tanks into Moscow, cancel independent newspapers, and play classical music on TV instead of the news. For a moment, it feels like the darkest days of the USSR are back. But in Moscow, one man refuses to accept it. Boris Yeltsin, the recently elected president of Russia, technically still part of the Soviet Union, calls the coup illegal. He rushes to the Russian parliament building known as the White House and climbs onto a tank surrounded by protesters. From there, he gives a speech broadcast around the world, urging the army and the people to resist. Images of Yeltsin standing tall in that tank become a symbol of defiance, the picture of the old empire breaking apart in real time. Yeltsin would later go on to set the negative precedent as Russia having a super overpowerful president that we see in Putin today. But at least in this moment, he was on the right side of history. Back to the story. Meanwhile, in Kiev, Soviet officials nervously wait for orders. The coup leaders tell Leonid, the head of Ukraine's parliament, to impose emergency rule. Leonid hesitates. He doesn't support the coup, but he doesn't openly challenge it yet either. He waits, watching to see who will win. And when it becomes clear that the coup is collapsing, he refuses to carry out any of its orders. After just 3 days, the radical communists surrender. Gorbachev returns to Moscow, angry and humiliated, but it doesn't matter anymore. The Soviet Union is finished. The coup meant to save it has only accelerated its collapse. In Kiev, Leonid and men like Levko Lukyanenko finally declare that Ukraine is free. Let's talk about why the coup mattered. The failed coup of August 1991 was more than just a power struggle in Moscow. It was the moment the world had seen them fail. In Kiev, the effect was immediate. People stopped being afraid, and the underlying sentiment in Ukraine was that if the mighty Soviet Union could crumble in 3 days, just maybe, Ukraine didn't have to be part of it anymore. It's August 24, 1991. Ukrainians are still feeling the excitement of the coup that took place 3 days earlier. Inside the Supreme Soviet building, Ukraine's parliament, the hall is packed. Deputies crowd the benches, journalists fill the aisles, and on the street outside, thousands of people wait, pressed up against the gates, straining to hear what's happening inside. At the front of the chamber stands Levko Lukyanenko, the former dissident who spent more than 25 years in Soviet prisons for daring to say that Ukraine should be free. Now, like out of a dream, he's holding a document he helped to write, one that could end the Soviet Union forever. He begins to read aloud. In view of the mortal danger hanging over Ukraine in connection with the coup d'etat on 19th of August 1991, and continuing the 1,000-year tradition of state building in Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada proclaims the independence of Ukraine. The room falls silent. Even the lifelong party members, men who had spent their careers serving Moscow, are listening intently. The world they know is ending and something entirely new is beginning. At the center of it all sits Leonid Kravchuk, Only a year earlier, he was a cautious communist bureaucrat. Now he presides over the birth of a nation. Kravchuk looks around the chamber and knows that this is the moment to act. He calls for a vote. One by one, the deputies raise their hands. Some do it with pride, some with hesitation, but nearly all of them vote yes. Out of 360 members, 346 support the declaration. Cheers erupt in the chamber. Outside, the crowd catches the news and explodes in celebration. Flags waving, people crying, strangers hugging in the streets. For the first time in modern history, Ukraine is officially independent. Lukyanenko lowers the paper and exhales slowly. After decades of silence, exile, and prison, the words he once whispered in secret are now law. And Kravchuk, ever the pragmatist, knows what comes next. Ukraine must now defend this fragile freedom and build a government. Ukraine must convince the world, including Moscow, that their independence is real. For that one day, though, none of the challenges mattered. The empire had fallen and Ukraine had spoken. So what exactly did Ukraine's Declaration of Independence say, and why was it such a big deal? Let's start with the basics. The declaration announced that Ukraine was no longer bound by the laws or the government of the Soviet Union. From that day forward, the Ukrainian parliament, not Moscow, would make the laws that govern the country. It also stated that Ukraine would create its own army, manage its own economy, and form its own government. In simple terms, it meant that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet version of Ukraine, was gone. In its place stood the independent state of Ukraine. But just as important as what the declaration said was how it happened. Ukraine's independence wasn't won through violence or war. It was peaceful, democratic, and decided by the people themselves. The same men and women who had once been forced into silence under Soviet rule were now standing up and voting in public for freedom. It was December 1st, 1991, a cold Sunday morning in Kiev. On the streets, people were walking, bundled in coats and scarves, towards schools, factories, and town halls. Not to work or school, but to vote. On the ballot, voters read this question, short and simple. Do you support the active declaration of independence of Ukraine? For the first time in modern history, Ukrainians were being asked what they believed. All across Ukraine, from the western mountains to the eastern coal fields, from the northern cities to the southern coast, people came out to make their choice. Farmers, students, factory workers, and soldiers all placed their slips of paper into clear boxes for everyone to see. By nightfall, the result was overwhelming. More than 90% voted yes. Even in regions where Russian was the main language, the majority said the same thing. Ukraine would be independent. And that very same day, Ukrainians also chose their first president. Out of 6 candidates, they elected Leonid Kravchuk, the pragmatic former communist who had helped steer the country through the storm of 1991. When the results were announced, church bells rang in Kiev and people wept in the streets. By the end of that day, the Soviet Union, once the largest empire on earth, had lost its second most powerful republic in Ukraine. Within weeks, it would vanish completely. Let's talk about why the December 1991 vote mattered. The referendum of December 1991 mattered more than any speech or declaration. This was millions of ordinary Ukrainians from every region standing up and saying the same thing. We want to be independent. It wasn't just people in western Ukraine or in Kiev. Even in the east and the south, where Russian language and culture were the strongest, a clear majority voted yes. That national unity shocked the world and made it impossible for anyone, even Moscow, to deny Ukraine's independence. And the man who now led the country, Leonid Kravchuk, was a symbol of that transformation. Kravchuk wasn't a fiery revolutionary. He was a careful former communist who understood how to adapt when history changed. His pragmatism helped Ukraine separate from the collapsing Soviet Union peacefully, without war or chaos. So in that one day, Ukraine had done something extraordinary. It had chosen its freedom and its first president through the quiet power of a vote. When the Soviet Union finally disappeared at the end of 1991, it was chaotic. And right in the middle of the chaos was Ukraine, trying to figure out how to live without the empire that had ruled it for 70 years. People used to joke that the separation between Moscow and Kiev wasn't going to be a remarriage, it was going to be a divorce. And like any divorce, it was messy, emotional, and full of arguments about who owned what. Things always get interesting when there are nuclear weapons involved, and when the USSR collapsed, Ukraine suddenly found itself sitting on the 3rd largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of warheads spread across its territory. They had belonged to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union no longer existed, so who owned them now? These were the types of problems that Leonid Kravchuk found himself negotiating. Ukraine said they're on our land and they're ours. Russia said they were Soviet and we're the Soviet Union's successor. President Kravchuk knew how dangerous that this was. He had to balance Ukraine's security, Russia's demands, and the world's fears of nuclear instability. He promised the West that Ukraine would be a responsible country, but he also made it clear that Moscow would not dictate Ukraine's choices anymore. Then came the fight over the Black Sea Fleet, the pride of the old Soviet Navy based in Crimea. Its ships flew Soviet flags, its sailors were mostly Russian, but its ports and bases were now on Ukrainian soil. Both nations claimed it. Meetings between Kravchuk and Russian President Boris Yeltsin stretched late into the night, filled with shouting, long silences, and slammed doors. Neither wanted to look weak, and neither could afford a military clash. Finally, they reached a fragile compromise. The fleet would be divided between the two countries, with both sides sharing the naval base for the time being. This made me stop and think, why would two countries loyal to their own selves agree to share a navy and a base? It was actually to avoid conflict at that time. Remember that Ukraine had nuclear weapons at the time, and Crimea, where the base was, had thousands of Russian soldiers stationed there. So these deterrents, the threat of nuclear weapons against Russia and the threat of Russian soldiers against Ukraine, prevented a major conflict. Inside Ukraine, there were still 800,000 Soviet troops stationed on its land, an army larger than most in Europe. That's where General Konstantin Morozov came in. Kravchuk appointed him as Ukraine's first Minister of Defense with one clear mission. Every soldier must swear allegiance to Ukraine or leave for Russia. Most stayed. They had homes, families, and roots in Ukraine. By 1992, Ukraine's takeover of those forces was complete, and for the first time in centuries, it had an army that saluted Kiev, not Moscow. Things were going well for Ukraine, but things were not all sorted yet. When the Soviet Union collapsed, its economy collapsed with it, and Ukraine was hit hard. Overnight, the country lost most of its trade, especially with Russia, its biggest economic partner. Factories that once filled Soviet orders shut down, store shelves went bare, and prices exploded. By 1993, inflation was out of control, more than 10,000% a year. People watched their savings disappear almost instantly. Their paychecks were worth less by the time they could cash them. Through it all, President Leonid Kravchuk tried to keep the country steady. He reminded Ukrainians that the struggle of independence was still better than the comfort of control. And in January 1993, Kravchuk made a defining choice. Ukraine would not join the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Moscow-led alliance meant to tie the former Soviet republics together. Ukraine would cooperate where it needed to, but it would not belong. It was a quiet, firm way of saying, we're free now, and we intend to stay that way. By 1993, Ukraine had a flag, an army, part of the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and its own government. It had survived its first great test, the divorce from Moscow, without war. The economy was fragile and life was hard, but there was no turning back. Ukraine was holding on to its sovereignty. The country had once been called Little Russia, but it was now Ukraine, separate, independent, and determined to chart its own future. Let's recap why the divorce from Moscow mattered. Every major issue was tangled up with Russia. The two countries were still deeply connected after decades inside the same empire. Ukraine had to negotiate everything from scratch. It had nuclear weapons, making it suddenly the world's third largest nuclear power. And no one knew who truly controlled them. It had to divide the Black Sea Fleet, a navy based in Crimea, that both nations claimed as their own. And it had to take command of 800,000 Soviet soldiers still stationed on its soil. President Leonid Kravchuk and General Konstantin Morozov, Ukraine's first defense minister, faced an enormous task, convincing those troops to swear allegiance to Ukraine or leave for Russia. By 1992, most chose to stay, a quiet but powerful sign that Ukraine was becoming a state and more than just name. At the same time, the economy was collapsing. The old trade routes to Russia broke down, factories stopped, and prices spiraled out of control in a wave of hyperinflation. It was one of the hardest times in Ukraine's modern history. Yet through it all, Ukraine refused to return to Moscow's orbit. In January 1993, it made that clear by refusing to join the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, as a full member, the organization that Russia hoped would replace the Soviet Union. In sum, these years were painful, but they were defining. Ukraine was proving that it could stand on its own. During the months June and July in 1994, Ukraine's presidential election is happening. At the time of the elections in 1994, the political landscape in Ukraine is reflected in the cities. For a city dweller in Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, or Mariupol at the time, the experience can be described like this. You walk past the quiet steelworks in the evening, your apartment block's heating systems are aging, the air has that familiar industrial smell, neighborhood parks are less maintained, Yet cafe culture is re-emerging. Private kiosks are opening where once only state stores stood. And you feel that whatever your hardship, you're in a country that's free now, and that gives you hope to endure it. In June 1994, Ukrainians go to the polls for the first round of voting. They have 7 presidential choices in front of them. On July 10th, the second round takes place, and they have 2 candidates to choose from. Leonid Kravchuk, the man who helped guide Ukraine through independence, stands as the incumbent. His challenger is Leonid Kuchma, who promises to reform the economy and improve relations with Russia. Most of Leonid Kuchma's supporters come from industrial areas in the east and south. Kuchma wins with about 52% of the vote. Kravchuk gets about 45%. On July 19, 1994, Kuchma is sworn in as Ukraine's second president. Kravchuk congratulates him. With that handshake and formal transition, Ukraine achieves something remarkable, its first peaceful transfer of power since Soviet times. This moment matters because it shows that independence is becoming real. Even though the economy is still weak, Ukraine proves it can hold an election, respect the outcome, and move forward peacefully. The 1994 presidential election was more than just a change in leadership. It was a test of Ukraine's democracy. When Leonid Kravchuk peacefully handed power to Leonid Kuchma, Ukraine accomplished something that few other post-Soviet states had managed: a democratic transfer of power without violence or crisis. That same summer, in June 1994, Ukraine also looked beyond its borders. It signed a cooperation agreement with the European Union, signaling that even in the middle of economic hardship, the young country was beginning to turn its gaze westward, toward Europe, reform, and a new identity. And before the year ended, Ukraine made another historic decision. Under the Budapest Memorandum, it agreed to give up the nuclear weapons it had inherited from the Soviet Union, the third largest arsenal in the world, in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In just a few years, Ukraine had gone from a Soviet republic to an independent, democratic, and nuclear-free nation, still struggling, still learning, but already shaping its own place in the world. It's worth pausing for a moment to think about what happened with the Budapest Memorandum. In 1994, 4 parties signed the agreement: Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The deal was simple in principle, but it was enormous in consequence. Ukraine, which had inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal after the Soviet Union collapsed, agreed to transfer all of its nuclear weapons to Russia for dismantling. In return, the 3 nuclear powers pledged to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and existing borders, and to refrain from using or threatening force or economic pressure against it. It wasn't a formal defense treaty, more a statement of political assurance, but at the time it symbolized trust in the post-Cold War order. Now looking back after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022, the question is impossible to ignore. Did Ukraine make the right choice by giving up its nuclear weapons in exchange for promises of security? Or has the response from the United States and the United Kingdom, the financial aid, weapons, and sanctions on Russia, shown that even without its own arsenal, Ukraine has still found powerful allies willing to stand behind it? Thank you for joining me for part 2 of 4 in our Modern History of Ukraine series. Next time for part 3, we'll be covering the years 1995 to 2014, and we'll learn about how oligarchs became so powerful in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me, your host, Carrie, for another episode of Diary of the World.